and welcome everyone to this 300 subscriber special. First off, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed to this channel and helped it grow. And also say thank you to everyone who have provided some very thought-provoking questions. I've been unable to answer them all, so I've taken a pick of the best. I had hoped to be joined today by my glamorous research assistant, but they just sent me a text saying they've been in London helping a retired railway solicitor in doing some archiving. Apparently they got carried away investigating the contents of his old briefs. Our first question is from Facebook, from Charles Armstrong Wilson, who asks if there is anything left made by Richard Trevithick. And the answer is definitely yes. Whilst none of his locomotives survive, one of his stationary engines, which were built for him by Hazeldine and Rastrick of Bridgnorth in Shropshire, certainly does. Engine number 14 is now preserved in the Science Museum in London. The engine was built around 1805, and it was discovered by Francis William Webb, the chief engineer of the London and North Western Railway, as scrap in 1885. He purchased it, had it taken to Crewe Works, where it was restored to its present condition. In fact, Webb had been apprenticed to Francis Trevithick at Crewe, the son of Richard Trevithick. Harry Underhill asks several questions about the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. First, to answer your question about livery. The yellow paint job which Rocket carried at the Rainhill Trials were basically its racing colours, rather like a jockey. There's no evidence that the Liverpool and Manchester Railway painted its locomotives yellow. Yellow was a really poor choice of colour for a locomotive. As a colour it was very fugitive, in other words it could rapidly fade. The type of paint used would react badly with heat and sulphide, and it would have gone brown very quickly. In fact, the actual colour of the engine was probably more closer to mustard than the canary yellow we see the replica, due to the type of paints available in the 1830s. Certainly the white paint on the chimney, made from white lead, would have burned off very quickly. We know Rocket was painted green by the time of the opening day, on the 15th of September 1830. So the yellow probably lasted less than a year, if that, given that Rocket's main duties were working ballast trains. Company accounts from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway show that only green and black paint were purchased for the locomotives. The boiler cladding was also painted green rather than being varnished, and all the metalwork was also painted black. To answer the question about splashers, we don't really know that Planet had them, but experience from the replica shows that they would be very useful. It's possible they were a local modification, but they aren't shown on any technical drawing for Planet or other locomotives supplied later to the Liverpool and Manchester. Finally, goods wagons. They were simple four-wheel affairs, an open platform wagon about 11 feet long, carried on 3 feet iron wheels. They had springs and the loads were secured with tarpaulins. I also hope that answered the first part of Ian Botham's question about the colour of Rocket. In answer to the second part of your question, Robert Stevenson had wanted to adopt inside horizontal cylinders from as early as late 1827, emulating the road coaches of Goldsworthy Gurney. And this was a layout he eventually came to with Planet. Other engineers like Edward Berry of Liverpool and Timothy Hackworth had also seen and admired Gurney's layout, and they too emulated it by adopting inside horizontal or near horizontal cylinders and crank axles at about the same time as Robert Stevenson. But Robert seems to have been the first to think about applying a crank axle and horizontal cylinders to a locomotive in 1827. To find out more about Planet, see my video. Ewan Ferguson, I have no proposed locomotives I'd like to see, but I suppose out of a sort of morbid curiosity, perhaps Thomas Harrison's Thunderer or Hurricane, the absolutely bonkers machines built for the Great Western Railway to Brunel's impossible design criteria. They'd be a massive waste of money, but would be absolutely fabulous to see. and would be a physical reminder that everything Brunel touched turned to engineering gold. Henner 4472. There's no evidence that Saint-Péray was sabotaged at all. What we do know is that the boiler leaked very badly. The water pump failed, and there may have been an issue with one of the cylinders. The boiler was made by the Bedlington Ironworks at Morpeth in Northumberland. Stevenson's had used Bedlington for years for their own boilers, heavy forgings, castings and wheels, but that firm had some serious quality control issues, including leaky boilers, uneven thickness of boiler plate, poorly made castings and axles, and that is why the Stevensons didn't use them for the boiler and other parts of the rocket. In fact, Rocket's boiler was made from Staffordshire plate sourced in Dudley. There was probably something wrong with one of the cylinders of Saint-Péray due to the enormous water consumption of the engine, and because Timothy Hackworth mentions in a letter of October 1829 that there was a problem with one of the cylinders which could have been easily dealt with at the trials, with the expedient of swapping one cylinder for another. The cylinders on Saint-Péray were the same as those on Rocket, and used what's called a floating core for the valve faces, which were cast integrally. 8 cylinders were cast for Hackworth, and he was told to take his pick. The fault with the cylinder was because the floating core had shifted slightly, and that was something which was completely undetectable at the time. And we know the Stevensons also had problems with this design of cylinder as used on Rocket, and they changed it immediately after Rocket, so the next batch of locomotives had cylinders to a design which avoided the use of floating cores. It was just probably a case of bad luck about the cylinder. It's also worth pointing out that in 1979, when the replica of Rocket was being made, the engineers had exactly the same problem in 1979 as they had in 1829 with casting these cylinders with floating cores. There's also a whole lot of utter nonsense from the pen of Hackworth's son about Wrenhill, which, to be honest, is best ignored. Chris Eden Green, hello chap. If the story of the Leicester and Swannington steam trumpet is bunk, how was a steam whistle as we know it invented? To give some context, the Victorian railway historian Clement Stretton, and I use the word historian very guardedly, because if Stretton couldn't find the data he wanted, he'd simply make it up. And if he found something that he disagreed with, he studiously ignored it. And what's worse is people would believe him, and they still do. Stretton tells a story of how a train on the Leicester and Swannington Railway collided with a farmer's cart carrying eggs and milk and other produce. This resulted in a local musical instrument maker in Leicester being approached to create a steam trumpet. The problem is there's no record of the accident in the board minutes or in the newspapers, no record of any musical instrument maker given by Stretton, and the board of directors give no minutes whatsoever to having such devices produced. However, the steam whistle was probably invented by a Welsh chap named William Stevens at the Dowlais Ironworks in South Wales sometime around 1833. A member of staff from Sharp, Roberts and Company of Manchester named Thomas Turner had been sent to Dowlais to put up some line shafting a few years later. He brought back to Manchester a cross-sectional drawing of Stevens' whistle with him. His foreman, a Mr. Rose, then showed this drawing to Alexander Fife, the Manchester shed foreman on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Alexander Fife thought this was an excellent idea, and it was adopted by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1835. Thomas Turner went on to work for Bayer, Peacock and Co. of Manchester and took his drawing of the steam whistle with him. In reply to Elite Clone, and we've had several questions about American railroads, railroad locomotives got to the USA because American engineers and capitalists had visited Britain. They liked what they saw and imported locomotives direct from British builders like Robert Stevenson and Company. The first locomotive to run in the USA, the Starbridge Lion, was built in the English Midlands, and the famous John Bull was also built in Britain by the Stevensons. American engineers, inventors and capitalists visited Britain in a steady flow to study railways and took ideas home with them. There were also books published in Britain about railways which also made the journey across the Atlantic. The problem was the cost of importing locomotives from Britain to the US, as the US Treasury plonked a massive import tax on them, which Congress, despite pressure from American railroads, refused to drop, and this began the American homegrown locomotive market in the middle of the 1830s. NCO Pictures and Logan Games also asked about doing videos on early American locomotives, and yes, I'd love to, and yes, I'm planning some. But the problem is getting hold of suitable pictures, so if you can help, feel free. But do check out my videos on the Aganoria, on the Lancashire Witch, and the South Carolina. Victorian Lad asks about the Dunalla Stairs and the first 460. The main thrust of this channel is from about 1804 to 1855, but I will be starting a new series of videos entitled Victoriana, which will look at later locomotives such as the Bloomers, the BT Well tanks, Hardwick, the Stirling Single, and locomotives like that. What was the best locomotive ever scrapped? Asked the New Republic of Dave. Best is as ever a subjective term, but in terms of early railway history, I think it was criminal that one of the Blenkinsop locomotives which survived into the 1860s was scrapped. I would love to see a replica of one of those machines. Also from Facebook, Cameron McTeague asked about the worst aspect of early locos design that lingered on and when better designs became apparent. I think that has to be the retention of vertical cylinders and the return flue boiler up and including the 1840s by some builders in the northeast. Tim Sampson asks on Facebook about Brunel's broad gauge, the gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inches. That's a toughie. It lost out in the Battle of the Gauges in the 1840s because there was so little of it. The Great Western was a discrete system all unto itself, whereas the 4 feet 8 and a bit inches gauge was pretty much the national gauge in England at least. Scotland tended to prefer a gauge of 4 feet 6, but some lines in England, like the Eastern Counties, used a 5-foot gauge. So if there had been more of it in terms of route miles, then perhaps it might have stood a better fighting chance. But the big problem of the broad gauge was the physical cost and the scale of building the thing. Tunnels especially were far larger than later standard gauge, with a comparative increase in cost compared to the standard gauge. Brunel neither really exploited the broad gauge properly either. He adopted it to increase the stability of locomotives and carriages, so that the wheels were always carried in outside bearings and the carriages could have big wheels and as low a centre of gravity as possible. Some of Brunel's early carriage designs are as mad as the earliest broad gauge locos, to be honest. And finally, one from a Mrs. Trellis of North Wales. Dear David, here is one of my favourite cuttings. 4.5 miles of double track north of Crewe. So thank you to everyone for so many really thoughtful questions, and I hope I've answered them all suitably. This has been a lot of fun to put together, and I look forward to the next one when we hit 400 subscribers. Thank you.